I can use it or you can use it, but we can't both use it at the same time. And that rivalry gives rise to scarcity, and that's kind of the topic for economics, the study of how we allocate scarce resources. Most goods we ever study in economics have this property, but ideas do not. Ideas instead, Romer said, are infinitely usable. You invent them once, and they could be used by any number of people after that. So think about the design of the mRNA vaccine for COVID, or the latest algorithm for ChatGPT-5. You invent that once. It may cost billions of dollars to invent it once, but after it's invented, the idea never needs to be invented again. It can be used by billions of people in both the case of the COVID vaccine and ChatGPT-5 in very short order. And the implication for growth is that living standards are determined by the total number of ideas. And to see why, what's going on in that sentence, what's the key word? The key word there is total. Suppose we said living standards are determined by the number of computers. Well, if we want to make one worker better off, we give them a computer. If we want to make 1,000 workers more productive in the same way, we need 1,000 computers. So living standards are determined by the number of computers per worker or per person, but not with ideas. Each invention potentially makes everyone better off. So semiconductors, the World Wide Web, solar panels, etc. Okay, next, where do ideas come from? On this, your grandmother was exactly right. They come from researchers and entrepreneurs and inventors. Basically, they come from people searching for new ideas, hopefully finding new ideas and either getting a lot of status or a lot of money in the process. And so the key insight here in the middle of the slide is that income per person is tied to the number of ideas, and the number of ideas is tied to the number of people. Where you start to see a subtlety is if you connect the first point in that chain, income per person, to the last point, the number of people. Income per person depends on the number of people. And if you apply growth rates to that, the growth rate of income per person depends on the growth rate of the number of people searching for ideas. And the growth rate of the number of people searching for ideas ultimately is tied to the growth rate of the number of people. And so there's this link between that 2% per year and population growth. And it all comes from people producing ideas and ideas having this infinite usability characteristic. Okay, so if you take this theory and apply it to some things, you learn something else that's very interesting and very much consistent with the theory. So to illustrate this, I have this simple word equation here, this framework that says economic growth on the left-hand side is determined by research effort on the right-hand side. And that's kind of what we were saying. Of course, how good are people at finding new ideas? How productive are they? There's some research productivity term in there. And so what I did with several co-authors in the last several years is study this equation empirically. Let's go look everywhere we can look where we can measure growth and where we can measure research effort and use this kind of framework to back out what's happening to research productivity over time. Okay? And what we see everywhere we look is the same thing. So we've looked at agricultural innovations like cotton and wheat and corn and soybeans, dating back to Grillicus, for example. We've looked at medical innovations, heart disease, cancer. We've looked at firm-level data, the publicly traded firms, privately traded firms. So we've looked everywhere, and we see the same thing. And one other place we looked, which is the example I want to show you, is Moore's Law. So Moore's Law, as you all know, is sort of the driving force behind the bulk of economic growth in the last 30 years. Moore's Law is this empirical regularity that the density of computer chips, the number of transistors you can fit on a computer chip, is doubling every 2 years. And you see the straight line on a graph with a ratio scale. Well, it's not surprising that I'm showing you two straight lines on a ratio scale. This is the same kind of thing. Of course, the growth rate is much, much faster here. Doubling every 2 years implies an exponential growth rate of 35% per year. So for 50 years, the productivity of putting transistors on computer chips was rising at 35% per year. Where did that growth come from? Well, presumably it came from all these great companies from Intel and AMD and Samsung and TSMC and ASML coming up with innovations that let us push this thing forward. So if you measure the research effort that went toward propelling Moore's law forward, you see the green line. And what this green line says, and we did this 10 different ways, so I'm showing you an example. There's some subtleties. How do you measure the research that IBM and AT&T and Motorola and Texas Instruments or National Semiconductor in the 80s and the 70s were doing? That's why it's research. What you see, though, the striking finding, is it requires 18 times more researchers today than it did in the 1970s to generate that doubling of computer chip density. Okay? We have to throw ever-increasing amounts of resources. You could see the growth in research effort is exponential, whereas the growth rate is a constant, the 35% per year. Okay? If you go back to that word equation, we see economic growth at 35% or 2%. You see research effort everywhere we look rising exponentially, and therefore it must be research productivity is declining. Ideas are getting harder to find. We have to invest ever-increasing resources in R&D just to maintain a constant rate of economic growth. And I think of this as kind of the Red Queen theory of economic growth after Lewis Carroll. Remember, the Red Queen said, you have to keep running faster and faster just to stay in the same place. And there's an element of this for growth. We have to throw ever-increasing amounts of resources at these hard problems in order to maintain that constant exponential. Okay, here's an example of that. Here's investment in ideas. And ideas could be sort of R&D directly kind of ideas, or even software. Software is an idea, ones and zeros. The ChatGPT algorithm is an idea. Even movies and songs and books are ones and zeros, and so you can think of those as ideas too. If you look since 1929, which is the National Income and Products Accounts going back, we see huge increases in the share of GDP devoted to propelling ideas forward, from less than 1% to nearly 7%. If you look at the private R&D share, you can see that rising, and I don't have time to spend time on this right now, but if you look at how much of R&D is publicly funded by the government, you can see the space program in the 60s that was really big, and it's kind of been shrinking ever since. And all of this predates, the data here ends in 2024, so this predates the Trump administration and the changes that they're doing. We're already spending a lot less as a share of GDP on publicly funded R&D, and whether that's good or bad is an interesting question to think about. Okay, so in summing up, what does the future of economic growth look like? I think there are headwinds and tailwinds. The headwinds, certainly ideas getting harder to find is one of them. Things I haven't talked about, educational attainment leveling out. The 20th century was the century of rising educational attainment. Average adult had 4 years of education in 1900 and 13 years of education by 2000, but also 13 years of education today. Graduation rates from high school and college have plateaued. Population growth, this growth rate of people that we know is incredibly important, you've seen in the last 5 years a huge appreciation of the fact that fertility rates are below replacement, and we may be headed toward an empty planet. We may be running out of people. Well, that, as you can imagine, has bad consequences for economic growth as well. There are also tailwinds. China and India in 1980 were so far behind the frontier, so poor that they couldn't meaningfully push things forward. They each have as many people as the US, Europe, and Japan put together, and now, as they've developed, especially China, but increasingly India as well, they're leaders in many of the key technology groups. I don't care if my faster iPhone computer chip is invented in Silicon Valley or Korea or China. I just care that my iPhone runs faster. And so again, this sort of infinite usability of ideas is important there. And this brings me to the last tailwind, AI. If you ask me what's the most important thing happening right now that might affect economic growth, it's certainly artificial intelligence. And so that's what I want to turn to now. So there are two main themes I'd like to start with and highlight and build on. The first theme is that AI is just the latest form of an automation process that's been going on since the Industrial Revolution. Okay? And the usefulness of that point is that it says we can use 200 years of economic history to help us understand what the possible consequences of AI might be. So what do I mean by automation? I mean replacing labor in particular tasks with machines or algorithms. So in the past, this looked like textile looms or steam engines or electric power or computers. And in the future, it certainly looks like driverless cars. Hopefully you've had a chance to ride in a Waymo. If not, definitely come to San Francisco and do that. But paralegals, pathologists, maybe researchers, maybe everyone. This is the kind of question we have to think about. So that's the first thing. We can use history to help us understand what the potential consequences of AI might be. And second, and partly building on this history, AI may be limited by what economists like to call Baumol's cost disease. And this is just a phrase that really just stands for bottlenecks. So what Baumol pointed out is that economic growth is often constrained not by what we do well, not by the stuff we're really good at, but by what's simultaneously essential and yet hard to improve. We're constrained by the stuff we're bad at, not by the stuff we're good at. And these bottlenecks are the source of a kind of scarcity, and that the scarce factors can get the high returns. And I'll come back to this point in a second. Right now it's kind of mysterious, but I wanted to lay that out for you. So what I want to think about now is speculate on the future of growth over the next 25 years based on partly the theory that I've told you. And I'm going to, I'm an economist with two hands. I'll give you an on the one hand and on the other hand. Let me start with the optimistic case. And what would AI accelerating economic growth look like? And I think the story here is actually quite compelling. So in the near term, we'd see productivity boosts from AI, for example, in software. And we're already seeing that. I don't know if you use AI at all to help you with any of your coding or any of your Excel spreadsheets, but it's amazing. Software programmers say easily 25% productivity improvements already. It's completely changing the way coding works. So, and remember the progress we've made in just 2 short years, right? We went from AI not being able to do anything to AI being able to meaningfully improve software productivity. AI can solve my math problems. I spend the happiest part of my life is spent on a whiteboard in front of my office, writing down equations of growth models and solving them. And I'm not very good at solving them. I'm slow. It takes me a while. I make mistakes. I have to go back. So I spend hours and hours doing this. I put my latest model on O1 Pro back in October. So just in October. Before October, AI was useless to me, or not entirely useless. I used it to write a birthday card to my mother-in-law, right? But it was a toy before October. But then I gave it the problem I was struggling with, and I'd spent 2 hours on the whiteboard getting a result. It thinks for 5 minutes, spits out 5 pages of beautifully formatted equations, and gets the same result. And that's when I said, oh my God, this is changing my world and maybe changing everyone else's world eventually. And so in the next decade, look at the progress we've made in the last 2 years. In the next decade, is it plausible that AI will have agents that can automate all computer coding? Sure. Dario Amodei, the CEO of Anthropic, thinks Anthropic programmers will not write code after 2026, so he thinks it's coming even sooner. And once AI can automate coding, you ask the AI to code up better AI algorithms, play with new algorithms, search for new algorithms. Google has AlphaEvolve, helping to search for new algorithms already, building on AlphaFold and AlphaZero. Remember, each of these algorithms, when you discover a new one, it's infinitely usable. You discover the new algorithm once, and then you serve it on billions of computers, right? And so there's this virtuous circle that could allow things to get even better. In particular, at some point, again, maybe a decade from now, we may have access to billions of virtual researchers, right? Anything that you could ask a remote worker to do on their computer, well, maybe that remote worker is an AI rather than a human. Anything that could be done on a computer by a remote worker seems like in a decade, would that potentially be automated? Possibly. Once we can do it once, we can do it 1 billion times, and then we've got 1 billion researchers. We automate most cognitive tasks, and one of the things we ask these 1 billion researchers to do is invent new ideas. design better computer chips, help us design better robots, simulate the robots in virtual reality land until you come up with a really good design, and then have people build the robots. Design better medical technologies. So AlphaFold 2, AlphaFold 3, protein folding, we're already doing this. Look at the progress we've made in 2 years and think about what the progress could be over the next decade. And then again, once we have pretty good robots and we have AI running the robots, then you've turned the automation of cognitive tasks into the automation of physical tasks too. And then what can't be automated, right? And so this is the story that the optimists tell us for why growth might accelerate. And for sure, this has the potential to raise growth rates substantially over the next several decades, right? When I look at this, and I'm one of the world's biggest skeptics about our ability to raise growth rates. Remember that straight line? I'll come back to that in a second. Even I look at this chain of reasoning and say, it's not clear to me where it breaks. And so that's the optimistic case for AI's impact on growth. Let me give you the on the other hand, and this comes back to the bottlenecks and the Baumol effects. So I think there are two lessons that we learn from economic history that are especially relevant here. The first is that new technologies take a lot longer than we think to diffuse throughout the economy, to be incorporated into businesses widely, and to have productivity effects on the economy. There's the famous quote from Bob Solow that I'm sure you've all heard, you see computers everywhere but in the productivity statistics. Well, what was true for computers was true for the internet, was true for electricity replacing the steam engine. These things operate on the decadal scale, more like 25 or 50 years rather than the 5 years. So is AI going to change the economy in the next 3 years? The economists would say seems pretty unlikely to us based on history. Okay, the second point is to go back to that straight line that I showed you on the very first slide. Remember, automation's been going on for 150 years, and growth rates haven't sped up at all. Think of all the amazing innovations that were behind the line that I showed you. So the development and the adoption of electricity and the spread of electricity throughout the economy, right? Internal combustion engines, jet engines, transistors, semiconductors, antibiotics, the internet, the smartphone, amazing innovations that certainly automate part of research too. Research today looks nothing like research 50 years ago. We're doing lots of automation, and yet straight line 2% for 150 years. And so one possibility is, remember, ideas are getting harder to find. Within any general purpose technology, you run out of steam. Right? So maybe these new great ideas are simply what kept growth from slowing. Maybe growth would have slowed had we not developed semiconductors or the internet or antibiotics. And then with this view, perhaps AI is the latest great idea that lets us maintain 2% growth for a while longer, for another 50 years. I think this is the pessimistic view. Again, I've been the world's biggest adherent of the pessimistic view before AI. When I look at these two views, I find myself closer to the optimistic view than the pessimistic view. And I think that, that's somewhat informative. But I think these are the two perspectives economics can offer. I don't know anything about the labor market. So I do have one slide, because I think we're all, my wife and my kids are very curious about how my kids are ever going to have jobs in the future. So I did want to put one slide on here, just make a few remarks. So the world where AI changes everything is a world where GDP is incredibly high. It's a world of abundance. And that abundance should solve a lot of problems. It will require redistribution. And redistribution is hard, but all economies, the US included, do a lot of redistribution already. So I think there's a transition there that is hard, and people losing jobs, I don't know about that. I haven't thought enough about that. I think it's incredibly important. One thing I will say, one lesson from macroeconomics is if you look across countries over long periods of time, over centuries, you see that as we get richer, we work less. And that's a good thing. Work in our models is a bad, not a good. That's why they have to pay us to do it. And so as we get richer, we take more leisure and enjoy visits to Aspen and do more things. So taking more leisure is not a bad thing, that's a good thing. There's also, though, good work and meaningful work. And here again, this is personal to me. Think about the AI solving my growth model. In the next 10 years or in the next 20 years, is it plausible that AI will be much better than me at building new growth models? I do think if AI changes everything, I think it's coming for me much sooner than it's coming for most of you, right? Because what I do, it's already doing, 2/3 of it better than I can. Well, how will I find meaning? My meaning, as you can imagine, is completely tied up with sitting at my whiteboard coming up with growth models. Well, if the AI can do it better than me, what do I have left to live for? Well, as I've pondered this, I think AI will invent superior growth models, and my colleagues and I will find meaning in sitting at the feet of the AI and having it lecture to us and teach us the new growth models to better understand the world. If you think about it, academics, we care about understanding things, and we'd love to be able to invent the new thing ourselves, but most of the time, none of us are Paul Romer. But learning to understand the world better is a lot of where our meaning comes from. So I do think there's reasons for optimism there. One other point, economists love to say what fraction of GDP is paid to labor versus capital. Well, you can divide capital into other things, buildings or machine tools or highways or computers. What fraction of GDP is paid to computers? Remember, the last 25 years, an explosion of computer adoption throughout the economy, incredibly powerful. We all live and breathe it every day. What's happened to the factor share of income paid to computers over this period? It's actually declined. It peaked in 2000, around 3% of GDP, and it's fallen by 1/3 to just over 2% of GDP. So again, this world where AI and computers are incredible, remember the Baumol bottlenecks. The computers are incredibly good. They're not scarce at all. The scarce factor is the talent, and the talent has seen its returns go up a lot. And so it's not clear that capital income share is going to go to 100% as AI takes over because we're constrained by our bottlenecks. Okay, let me spend the last 5+ minutes talking about something that I think doesn't get nearly enough attention now, partly because it sounds crazy. But I think, as I've thought about it, I think it's not crazy, and I think it's incredibly important. So catastrophic risks, existential risks, the AI doing bad things somehow. So in particular, I've written 2 papers on this, and the approach I've taken is, can we use economic analysis to say anything about these risks? And to my surprise, in some ways, the answer is yes. So what do I mean by this risk? I think you've all heard these stories, but I think there are kind of 2 versions of bad outcomes. One is the bad actor version. Imagine ChatGPT-7, this incredible oracle that can answer any question you ask it. It can answer any question anyone asks it. Well, is there a bad actor somewhere in this big world who asks it to design a new virus that's extremely lethal and takes 3 weeks to display symptoms? Seems possible. Nuclear weapons were the last sort of really dangerous technology, threatening the world. They were manageable because they were so rare. We had 2 groups that needed to negotiate, and that worked out. But if every person had access to a red button, could we ensure that none of the 8 billion people pressed the red button? I'm not so sure. The second version is the more out there version, which I like to think of as alien intelligence. So how would we feel? Suppose this afternoon we get a report that there's a spaceship out by Pluto heading for Earth. How are we going to feel about that? 90% excited, but I think 10% we'd say, well, wait, maybe that doesn't end well for us, because we've seen the history of sort of more advanced civilizations and species encountering less advanced civilizations and species, and it often doesn't end well for the less advanced one. Stuart Russell, a computer scientist at Berkeley, who's the co-author of one of the graduate student machine learning textbooks, I was on a panel with him, and he had a quote that I liked a lot. He said, "How do we have power over entities more powerful than us forever?" And that's a question worth pondering. Okay, so economic analysis. What can we do to learn about this? So I have 2 papers. The first one is kind of what I call the Oppenheimer question. It's kind of a thought experiment. Importantly, Sam Altman, Demis Hassabis, Jeff Hinton, Dario Amodei, the founders of these AI companies, they were motivated in part by making sure we develop advanced AI safely. That was the charter of OpenAI. And so the world's experts on these things are very worried about this, which is one reason why I think we should take it seriously. So the Oppenheimer question is this crazy thought experiment of the kind that, economic theorists like to do. So here, the idea is if nothing goes wrong, let's give AI the benefit of the doubt and say it accelerates growth to 10% per year. Okay? But there's a one-time small chance that AI kills everyone on Earth. Do you press the button or not? Okay? What risk are you willing to take? Suppose it's a 1% chance or a 10% chance. What risk are you willing to take? Well, I can ask our economic agents in our standard models that we use to study everything else what risk they're willing to take. And you get some interesting findings. First, it's not surprising at all. I have a great life in Palo Alto. Stanford's a beautiful place. Aspen's a beautiful place. Our high living standards, coupled with diminishing returns to consumption, right? Economists love diminishing returns. There's diminishing returns to consumption on a given day. I don't need a fourth flat screen TV or a third iPhone, right? And so I'm only willing to take a tiny risk to get that 10% growth. I already have a pretty good life. The thing that surprised me is the next bullet point. Well, if AI is good enough to accelerate growth to 10%, it's probably also going to cure heart disease and cure cancer and other things like that. And then it turns out you're willing to take huge risks, surprisingly large risks, say 25% risk of AI killing everyone to get the gains in life expectancy. It's not the gains in consumption that are crucial. And the way to think about this is, sure, they're diminishing returns to consumption, but once we're talking about AI saving lives, we're comparing lives and lives. You don't have to go through the diminishing returns. So I don't care what kills me, I care about not dying. And if it's cancer or heart disease or AI, they're all kind of on equal footing. So, if AI could cut mortality rates in half, you're willing to take a pretty large risk on the existential side to get that. Okay, then of course we don't want to take the existential risk. So the second paper I wrote is how much should we be spending right now on AI safety? And I thought I wouldn't have anything to say about this until I had one insight. And the insight was that we've just recently faced exactly this question, or not exactly, but very much a parallel, and that was COVID-19. In COVID-19, each of us faced a mortality risk of something like 0.3%. We didn't know what it was initially, but it turned out to be around 0.3% on average, right? We spent 4% of GDP mitigating that risk by not going out, by shutting down the economy. Well, I suspect the AI risk is at least 0.3%. Certainly, Sam Altman and Demis Hassabis think it's bigger than that. So maybe we should be spending at least that much. Maybe we're massively underinvesting in mitigating this risk. Now you might say, well, was the 4% too much or too little? Maybe we overspent in that case, so it's not so relevant. Well, a better intuition comes from the value of life. You probably know the Department of Transportation, the EPA, government officials use values of life all the time, and the value of life they use for the average American is $10 million. To avoid a 1% mortality risk, you're willing to pay 1% of $10 million to avoid it. That's $100,000. That's more than per capita GDP. Right? And so this 4%, if anything, was underinvesting, not overinvesting. And so if we thought this X risk is going to materialize over the next 2 decades, you could, by this calculation, be willing to pay 5% of GDP every year for 20 years if you could avoid the risk. Now we know it's the weak link in this argument is, well, how effective is the spending? And so that's why there's a paper to think about how effective is the spending. And we don't know exactly, but if you take that into account, the intuition goes through. And in particular, could we justify spending 1/3 of 1% of GDP on mitigation? That's $100 billion. That's a lot of money. We're not spending anything like that. I think we're missing an opportunity there. Okay, let me just conclude with 2 quick thoughts, and I'll open up for questions. So how much did the internet change the world between 1990 and 2020? I think the answer is profound. How much is AI going to change the world between 2015 and 2045? Probably by even more. I think it's a more important technology. Just because it takes 30 years instead of 5 doesn't mean the long-term effects won't be large. I think we should focus on the long-term effects. And then on the underinvestment and mitigating risks, two points I haven't mentioned yet. So again, Sam Altman founded OpenAI to do it safely, and yet he's racing ahead. Why is he racing? Well, we have this sort of negative patent race dynamic applied to AI. Namely, there are 5 labs racing. each individual says, look, if I don't race, we still die anyway if we're going to die. But if I race, if we don't die, I might win, and then I'll go down in history as the most important person who ever lived. And yeah, so they all race. They're imposing these negative externalities. They'd all like to stop, but they can't. So a policy that I think is worth considering, should we tax NVIDIA's computer chips, tax GPUs, and use the revenue to subsidize safety? I think that's exactly the kind of Pigouvian logic that economists like, and this would, slow down research on AI by taxing the GPUs, and maybe a huge tax, and give us the revenue to fund safety. Okay, thank you very much. Happy to open it up for questions.
They're not circulating one, sorry, Scott.
Yeah, we are.
Great remarks. You've gotten us all very interested. A question for you on the notion of spending to mitigate AI risks. So spending to mitigate COVID was research on vaccines, production and distribution. But what is that parallel in AI risks? Because we're not developing a vaccine against AI harms. I'm curious about whether, if that spending is money to restrain the progress of AI so that it doesn't become as dangerous, well then the economic benefits of the AI are similarly reduced. So walk us through what you're thinking it means to spend to mitigate AI risk.
Yeah, no, great question. So each of these labs have teams of people devoted to AI safety, and you could ramp up the size of those teams, and so that's one direct way. You would also, I think, slow down things. Let's go more slowly to make sure the safety research can keep up with the speed at which things are advancing. Oh, taxing the GPUs. If the GPUs are way more expensive, that slows things down, right? Imagine, and I don't mean a 10% tax, imagine a 10x tax. By the way, one comment people often say is, well, what about China? If we slow down and China raises their head, bad things happen. I think that's missing the point here. First of all, taxing NVIDIA chips taxes China as well, because China's using NVIDIA chips. But also, the China versus US thing is very much like the US and the Soviet Union in the nuclear world. China doesn't want to destroy the world either. We negotiate, we get third-party verification. The other thing I'll say about what does safety look like, interestingly, Google and DeepMind, if you look at AlphaFold and AlphaEvolve, these are very narrow things, in particular targeted on the health side. And I think narrow AI targeted on the health side is exactly what we should be doing. There's still risks there, but at least it takes a bunch of the risks off the table. So I do think there are things we can do there. But it certainly, more thought there would be very welcome.
I'll ask the next one and then
Great.
I'll hand it to you. So I just looked up the biggest 5 companies in the S&P: NVIDIA, Microsoft 1 and 2. Those are AI plays. You forgot Apple is 3, which is the mobile disruption, which you didn't talk about. You acted like we went from web to this, but we didn't. Mobile was in the middle. And then Amazon and Meta are 4 and 5, and they were the internet disruption. My question is, your chart was limited. Your thesis, I think, is that ideas are what create this GDP, and therefore it's 2%. What if algorithms are creating the next ideas? I mean, Mark Zuckerberg is paying people $100 million each to create superintelligence, which is machines, training machines. Might be a lousy vision and he's gonna write it off and go bankrupt, fine. But if he's right, it will not be people inventing the next ideas, it will be machines, for better or worse. How does that go into how does that influence your economic theory and all the work you've been doing?
Yeah, no, that is there. So remember I said people create ideas currently, and population growth is slowing. I talked about ideas getting harder to find. The more resources we can throw at these idea problems, the faster we could accelerate growth. It's exactly that. It's the AI starting to invent new ideas. It's hard to reproduce people. It's hard to reproduce Einsteins. It's very easy to reproduce the latest AI algorithm. And so behind that accelerating growth slide that I had is exactly AI inventing new ideas. So that's the optimistic scenario, provided it doesn't kill us all. So I think that's exactly what I'm talking about. So I agree with you. Yes?
So could you talk more about Baumol effects, scarcity, and labor markets? And in particular, like, I don't know, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, the manual work was to be automated. Now it's the cognitive work that's being automated. So in the long term, is that going to be the case, or are we going to solve the manual work perhaps even sooner than the Baumol effects for the highest value programmers?
Yeah, great question. I think until 5 years ago, everyone thought automation was about replacing routine tasks done by anyone, but routine tasks. But especially low-skilled labor and even routine tasks done by high-skilled labor. It was very much the routine stuff that got replaced first. I think the big surprise over the last 5 years is that creativity is much easier to replace than we thought. AI is incredibly creative, right? I used to not think the stuff that I did was routine. It doesn't feel routine, but it turns out the AI is really, really good at it. So I think when you look at the timeline of replacement, I think I get replaced long before the plumber and the electrician and the manager of top companies. I think those are skills that are actually still very hard, but AI plus robots plus replacing cognitive tasks, replacing physical tasks, that covers kind of almost everything, I think. You can ask, I don't think there'll be nothing left for humans to do. So a bullet point I skipped over was Magnus Carlsen, right? My iPhone can beat Magnus Carlsen at chess, and yet chess has never been more popular than it is today. People spend lots of time watching chess tournaments on YouTube, right? Chess has never been more popular. Why? Because there's some things that we will reserve for humans, even though AI can do it better. Right? And so when I think of the list of those things, I think there are a lot of the things that, when my kids were my daughter used to dance ballet, and when she went to college, I said, oh, you can't be a ballerina in the future, you have to do something in STEM. And it turns out the arts, ballet, music, chess, sports. I want to watch Messi for FC Barcelona. I don't want to watch the robots play FC Barcelona. So I think there's some tasks we will reserve for humans. Those tasks will be scarce. Those are the things that robots can't do because we put value on humans doing them. And so back to my computer share of GDP, those are the tasks that'll earn a lot of money, actually. Now, it may be a superstar economy, so it may not be that there's enough money there. We can't all be Magnus Carlsen. But we can all learn to play guitar and get satisfaction from playing guitar and playing in a band with our friends and going to summer camp with our friends and getting the AI to teach us the latest and greatest thing that we care about. And so I tritely call it, I took this phrase off the slide, but I think about it, the future is one long summer camp. And I do think there is a bright future somehow related to those things. I think we'll find meaning, but it is a challenge. In the back.
So when you think about the way that work is being reimagined and the fact when you think about the way that work is being reimagined and the fact that that even high intellect work is going to be automated, do you think this introduces a concept, I guess reintroduces the need for UBI? As an economist, do you see this coming up in your discourse? I was recently at a lecture by someone from John Deere, and he was explaining how hundreds of thousands of hectares of land would be able to be covered from my mobile phone and not too far into the future. And so whether you're dealing with agriculture, very manual labor, or high intellect labor, you're seeing robotization and AI taking jobs. So how are we going to make ends meet?
Yeah, I think we will need redistribution, and whether it takes the form of exactly UBI or not, I think it does look something like that. Like the vision I have in mind is, imagine giving every kid when they're born a couple of shares of NVIDIA or the S&P 500 or something. If those companies are incredibly valuable, then we just give everyone a little bit. If the pie, the world where AI raises growth rates to 10% per year is a world of incredible abundance. And we already redistribute a lot. Bill Gates gives away a lot of money. I suspect we'll find a way to redistribute. But I do think it'll be important, and I do think it's a political problem that if you wanted to tell me it's very difficult and we're not going to do it, I wouldn't take the other side of that argument for sure. This is not something I've thought carefully about. It is, I realize these political problems are incredibly hard and subtle, but I do think something like what you're saying is probably, in this world where AI accelerates growth profoundly, that's going to have to be on the table. Yes?
Long-term effects for our children. That's my big concern, is I don't think with work ethic and I think with, as a mom myself.
Yeah, my kids are 25 and 22, and it's hard. So we think about this same thing. I do think, when I think about the world 50 years from now, I can see the problems being solved, and I do worry that the transition's hard. So young people are finding it hard to get jobs. You've seen the unemployment rate of young college graduates is higher rather than lower. It used to always be below the other unemployment rate for the average economy, and now it's higher. And, do young people struggle in the next decade while we make this transition? It seems like they're already struggling. So I do think this is a valid thing to worry about. Social media, as Attorney General of Colorado last night said, just made things worse in the last 10 years. And we should be very careful about running these experiments at scale without thinking through the consequences. I do think that's very important. Yeah, in the back. One more.
When you're talking about the sort of solutions to X risk and the spending, a lot obviously hinges on your sort of P-doom, the probability of doom that you have there. And so one question I have about that is, probabilities about the future are always complicated, but there is a tension in your earlier talk about bottlenecks and Baumol's cost disease, because a lot of the X risk factors hinge on a sort of fast takeoff in this space. And so if history says that these technologies are not adopted fast, then it would suggest that the X risk is probably much lower. And then the second thing on that probability also hinges somewhat, your metaphor was of an alien intelligence, but these machines are literally trained on our intelligence as inputs. And so in many ways, that incorporation of our mental state into that suggests they're not particularly alien, and the fact that they'll have to be integrated into society, perhaps over a slower amount of time, suggests that in many ways they will look often quite a lot like we do. And so I wonder how you think about that affecting your probability there, because that does seem like the key number to your equation.
Yeah, no, one of the things I liked about that first paper where I did the Oppenheimer experiment is I didn't have to pick the number. Instead, I could let the model spit out the number, like, what risk would a person be willing to take? And so, the surprise to me was if you start to think about AI curing cancer, then you're willing to take surprisingly high risks, like 20 or 25%. So I didn't have to pick a number. In the second project, I do have to think about numbers, and I consider a range. I have no idea what the right number is. It seems to me it's bigger than 0.3%. It seems to be the fact that the leading experts of these AI labs find it to be a problem that they historically have taken very, very seriously. It's something we should take seriously. And even if in my simulations, I sort of just plugged in a number like 1% and found you wanted to spend 5% of GDP a year. So it doesn't take much risk to make us want to do it. One thing I should have said about those experiments, one reason I didn't write that paper for a while is I thought, if you consider future generations and hundreds of billions of future people, okay, then you're going to say we should spend a lot. What I liked about the COVID example, and what that paper does, is it says, no, from a selfish standpoint, only caring about us, ignore future generations, we still should be spending $100 billion a year. So if you want to put weight on the future, kind of as we do, you'd say even bigger case to spend more. So I don't know what the exact number is, but I think for those kind of calculations, you don't need to plug in crazy numbers to get the findings that I was getting. But thanks very much for all the comments.
All right. Thanks so much, Chad. Both inspiring and totally terrifying.